director of a company, your job pretty much is to try and present as wide a repertoire as you possibly can in order to fly the flag for opera so that you get more and more people in. Often you're told that people say, I hate opera, and usually that means that the people have never been. Or indeed, if they have been, they've been to one that didn't particularly float their boat. And so the job of an artistic director, as I said, to try and provide as many opportunities as people can find to find their great joy. I'm trying to give myself a little bit of space here, which is all right. That's fine. But that means that sometimes you have to put to bed some of your great... What have I done? Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. How about we close it down? That's it.
You want to play the video?
Eventually, yes. We're all it's all happening here. Talk amongst yourselves. Okay, and if I do that, you're going to come up here and help me about that? Okay, great. Okay, so that's all fine, but you try and present as wide a repertoire as you can. But the thing that has always floated my boat, the thing that has always been at the core, I suppose, of my theatrical journey and my whole life was this, as I say, slightly unholy passion for Gilbert and Sullivan. And again, it's not the most fashionable of views. I'm sure many people in this room, actually I can ask for a show of hands, who's been in a GNS at high school or at school? You see, look, 20 years ago, I would have asked the same question and everybody would have put up their hand. I blame Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice for Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and suddenly musicals at school had to be major issues with people with microphones on and major sets. In my day, the arts teacher would have to do the scenery, and so he was quite happy with Gilbert and Sullivan because you had to only do one a night at an all-boys school. Of course, the young boys played the girls, and we've all done our now classic cadishes in that time. But Gilbert and Sullivan has always been a major part of my life. I do a one-man show, which I'm going to be doing in the festival later on, and so let me start by going down this. I wrote this when I was 16, when I had appeared at the Farrer Memorial Agricultural High School production of Ruddy Gore, playing Sir Despard Murgatroyd. It was a revelatory performance by contemporary accounts. And as I said, I've been worshipping at the shrine ever since. And I wrote this, and I said, and it came to pass that on the 18th day of November, 1836, was born to a British naval officer a child, William Schwenk Gilbert, and the parents rejoiced. Now 6 years passed until, on the unfashionable side of London, another child was born, this time to a bandmaster, a child who was to be called Arthur Seymour Sullivan, and the parents rejoiced. The two boys met and worked, and the people rejoiced, and the people are still rejoicing. So, as I said, I wrote that nearly 40 years ago, or over 40 years ago now, and I looked up my notes at the time, and they're all, I've photocopied them all. This is in 18-year-old's handwriting. Why does GNS appeal so much? For me, it's this absolute fascination and adoration of the English language. And we are at a time now where people forget just how to write letters. I mean, we've all gone on Grammarly, we've all got that sort of stuff. But as a 16-year-old, I was performing this role at high school, an agricultural high school. How bizarre is that? And the agriculture teacher, Ian Alexander, lent me a book called Martin Green's Treasury of Gilbert and Sullivan. And this was a huge book. I've still got it at home, and I remember I should have brought it today, but there you go. It had all of the librettos of the shows, and it annotated all of the librettos with all of the meanings of it was a lexicon as well, all of the meanings of these quite arcane classical references, and words like caravanserai, which you don't find in common language these days, or philomel, or a strange magic in this love of ours, as rivals as we all are in the affections of our Reginald. I just couldn't believe this writing. And that was before I knew the music. So I came to love the pieces basically by reading them, reading the performance practice of the D'Oyly Carte Company, and eventually my love of the genre came when I suddenly discovered the music. Now, I will tell you now that Joe Falkenmeyer's music shop, sports shop actually, but a music shop in Tamworth, didn't stock a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan, but I did manage to get on the World Record Club site and found a lot of the LPs there, and suddenly you discover Sullivan. This was the most extraordinary composer in the Victorian age, the most famous Victorian composer before Parry and all of those people. He was knighted by Queen Victoria for his services to classical music rather than to his work with Gilbert and Sullivan. And he was a master of pastiche. He was a master of knowing all of knowing the Verdi repertoire. If you buy any score from the Victorian age now, almost always it will have in the front, edited by Dr. Arthur Sullivan, as he was then. So his references to the classical repertoire were huge. So that was the first time I heard of Handel. It was the first time I heard of Verdi. First time I heard of any of these great Purcell, any of these great composers. Even Wagner gets a Guernsey in Iolanthe, for example. And suddenly a whole world of classical music opened up to me, and I was able to use the GNS as in a way a springboard into what I have later become. Indeed, my first job as Kay was saying, as a trainee assistant stage manager, the longest title in Opera Australia's history, was because I loved Gilbert and Sullivan, and they were doing their first production of a piece called Patience, which was an early one starring the great Dennis Olsen, Adelaide icon Dennis Olsen, and they got me because of my love for GNS. So it's always been there in the past. But let me talk about the two themselves. Gilbert and Sullivan were the heads of their respective trees in Victorian England. As I said, Sullivan was a respected Victorian composer. He is most famous for his oratorios, and let's face it, oratorios ain't the most fashionable things these days, but huge oratorios that he created for the Leeds Festival, etc. Things like The Light of the World, the Prodigal Child, etc., etc. He was a hugely successful classical composer. He was a child prodigy. He was sent to Leipzig as a Mendelssohn scholar, and wrote his first great Te Deum when I think he was 13. Came back and was the absolute fashionable icon of classical music in Britain. Gilbert was slightly different. He was older. He originally trained as a barrister with spectacularly little success. Indeed, he within the first 4 years he had 19 briefs, and it was, as I said, a very inauspicious career. But he was a writer, and he wrote for a thing called Fun magazine, which was the precursor of the old Punch magazine, which I'm sure you will remember. So a gentleman called Richard D'Oyly Carte, nicknamed Oily Carte because he was quite a businessman. Richard D'Oyly Carte brought together this great classical composer and this great playwright, as he was in Britain, to create an English comic opera. D'Oyly Carte had been the English agent for all of the operas of Offenbach, and he was sick to death of 10% of all of the royalties for those particular performances going back to France. So he decided that he wanted to create an English comic opera that wouldn't offend any sensibilities in Victorian England. So he brought Gilbert and Sullivan together in 1875 to create a piece called Trial by Jury. Many unkind critics have said that Trial by Jury was Gilbert's revenge on the legal profession for his own failure at the bar. But it's a piece of absolute nonsense and a masterpiece. It was an afterpiece to the English production of La Pericole by Offenbach, and it was a huge success, starring Fred Sullivan, who was Sullivan's elder brother. And the most exciting thing about it was that it showed contemporary people on stage in contemporary dress, and it was and just complete anarchy as far as the piece is concerned. At that stage, Dorlicart knew that he was on a good wicket, so he entered into a relationship with Gilbert and Sullivan to provide an opera as long as he gave him 6 months' notice. So the next piece that they did was a piece called The Sorcerer, which was in 1887. The most important thing about The Sorcerer, apart from the fact that we're doing a performance of it later on, is that it was the first full-length Gilbert and Sullivan, the first two-act Gilbert and Sullivan. And what it did was to create an ensemble of players that would then become synonymous with the Gilbert and Sullivan operas for the rest of the canon. So it had the comic man who would play all of the comic man roles, George Grossmith. It had the heavy baritone roles created by the most hysterically named Rutland Barrington, Richard Temple. There was the elderly, ugly spinster who was always there. Mrs. Paul was her original, and there was a lady called Harriet Everard who played Mrs. Partlet. These people were to become the stalwarts, I suppose, of the Gilbert and Sullivan company. And added to that, you always had the love interest. Almost invariably, the soprano is one of the cleverest people on the stage, and certainly a gold digger, and the tenor is almost invariably slightly dim. As Gilbert said, where can your grand opera soprano who can act be found? But The Sorcerer had a reasonable success, but after that, again given 6 months' notice by Dorlicart, they created a piece called HMS Pinafore. And HMS Pinafore just took over the world. Indeed, so popular was the piece that in 1879, a year after it performed for the first time in the West End, there were two rival productions playing in Australia, in Melbourne, roughly in the same positions as the Comedy and Her Majesty's in Exhibition Street there. One of them starred a drag queen called Leon, who was in Christie Minstrels at the time, and the other starred the great Australian soprano Nellie Stewart, Victorian Nellie Stewart, and she was playing the role of Rafe Rackstraw, the tenor role. But at that particular time, an American businessman was doing a lot of work in Australia and having great success, and he could smell a good business opportunity. So we got on the first boat, and went back to, it took a long time, went back to England to get from Gilbert and Sullivan the rights to perform their works in perpetuity in Australia. He came back to Australia, put his wife, Miss Maggie Moore, into the lead role of Josephine, and he took the comic role for himself, and his name was Mr. J.C. Williamson. And J.C. Williamson at that stage created an empire in Australia which has not been equalled. Many of you, I'm sure, will remember when the Tivoli or the Her Majesty's in town here were J.C. Williamson's theatres. This was this huge empire that was created basically on the back of Gilbert and Sullivan. He did a hugely successful season of HMS Pinafore, and that was followed by the next opera that Gilbert and Sullivan wrote, which was The Pirates of Penzance. The extraordinary thing was that when a new production was created in London, they created usually 4 sets of frocks and settings. And one of them was to go to New York for an authorised version of the shows in New York. One was sent out on a boat to Australia, and the other went on tour in England, plus the original London productions. So this was an extraordinary time where people would come out to Australia, and for example, the first performer of the Fairy Queen in Iolanthe would appear in Australia less than 6 months later, playing that same role. She then stayed in Australia and created all of the contralto roles up until the 1890s. We have a huge tradition of interest in these particular pieces. Following the Pirates of Penzance basically was created because copyright laws in those particular times were particularly slack, and if you sent somebody into an auditorium and to write down the music, and you would be given a libretto when you entered the theatre, that was the what you basically got as far as a program is concerned, you could then set up your own show somewhere else. So famously in America, just after the success of Pinafore, D'Oyly Carte went across to America to set up his own authorised version of Pinafore, and had a press conference where he said that at present there are 42 companies performing the piece through America. Companies that are formed after 6 p.m. are not included. So he set up, and of course set up the British copyright. That being said, Pirates of Penzance was the second. Of course, they were called pirate companies. This is one of the reasons that they decided Pirates was a good name for the next show. And in order to secure the copyright there was a tour of Pinafore going down to Paynton in Britain, down on the south coast. And so they basically put handkerchiefs around their heads, performed Pirates of Penzance with script in hand, just so that they had the copyright for the British performances as it opened in New York at exactly the same time. Gilbert seemed to have a thing for the letter P, so Pirates of Penzance was, Pinafore was followed by Pirates of Penzance, and the next piece was a piece called Patience. And Patience is a spectacularly funny opera which satirised a thing called the aesthetic movement. And the aesthetic movement was this revolution in art that swept through Victorian England like the proverbial dose of salts. And probably the most famous advocate of the time was 3 minutes. I've got 3 minutes. I've got to get through the other 14 operas in 3 minutes. That's fine. But it was Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde saw Patience just after he... 5, thank God. Saw Patience just after it transferred to the newly built Savoy Theatre, and he said that satire is the homage which ignorance pays to genius, which didn't go down terribly well. But Richard D'Oyly Carte, when he was putting Patience on in America, of course the aesthetic movement had absolutely no traction in America. He sent Oscar Wilde on a lecture tour of America to lecture the Americans into what the aesthetic movement actually was, and eventually D'Oyly Carte said, well, actually, I could have got a sandwich man for half the price. So that wasn't the reason he said it. But Patience was followed by a wonderful piece called Iolanthe, which many of you will know, a satire of the British House of Lords. I just did a production of this in Brisbane recently with a whole pile of kids from the Griffith University, and the joy of it was, without changing a single word, still the moment that had most laughter from the audience was when one character at the beginning of Act 2, talking about the House of Lords, says, when in that house MPs divide, if they've a brain and cerebellum too, they've got to leave their brains outside and vote just as their leaders tell them to. So still, these words are still remarkably apt today. Iolanthe was followed by a piece that was not particularly successful. It was a perversion of a piece by Alfred Lord Tennyson called The Princess, but again it satirises the idea that females should actually be admitted to university. As with Gilbert, it's always a satire which is turned on its head. So it's something that he believed passionately, and he showed the stupidity, I suppose, of the Victorian establishment. After Princess Ida, probably their greatest success was created, a piece called The Mikado, and this was basically Britain was in the throes of an absolute passion for anything Chapinrazerie. So at Knightsbridge they had a Japanese exhibition, for example, and the apocryphal story is that Gilbert bought a samurai sword, hung it up in his library, and at one stage in the middle of the night where he's desperately trying to find the idea for a new opera, this fell to the ground and he got the idea of doing a piece set in Japan. We were just discussing on the table how difficult issues of cultural appropriation are these days, and Mikado, I hope, will never be relegated to the scrap heap, because let's face it, it's a satire of England. It's got nothing to do with Japan at all, but it's still the most performed and the most, I won't say loved, but certainly the most performed of all of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas. That was followed spectacularly by their first great failure, which was a piece called Ruddigore. On the opening night, D'Oyly Carte was very clever in that he initiated the whole idea of queuing for shows. So he set up a theatre built with the spoils of of Gilbert and Sullivan, which was the Savoy in London, still there. And basically the middle class would be in the stalls. The dress circle was for the upper class, and the gods was for the working class people. And people could queue up during the day for very cheap feats to go to the very top of the theatre. And if you go to England now, it's remarkable to go to the Savoy Theatre. You can sit at the very back of the circle. It's about a 990-seater, very back of the circle, and you can hear every word clear as a bell. It was the most glorious little theatre. But on the opening night of Mikado, there were all of these boos and hisses coming from the upper circle of give us back the Mikado and not as good as the Mikado. But it's a wonderful satire on the British love of melodrama. It also happens to be my favourite, but that's a different story. Immediately following Ruddigore, Yeoman of the Guard was the best idea. Sullivan was always railing against Gilbert's ideas of this topsy-turvydom, and he wanted to create an opera which was about real people and real emotions and passions. So they wrote this piece called Yeoman of the Guard, which is set, strange enough, in the Tower of London. Gilbert had a great passion for all things British and military, so he wanted to put all these people on stage, but it's the closest they ever came to presenting a grand opera. Following that, nearly there, they created a piece called The Gondoliers, which is probably second only to the Mikado in popularity, along with Pirates Penzance in popularity. This is an incredibly sunny, wonderful piece. Gilbert gave Sullivan his head. It's the longest, the most number of pages of any Gilbert and Sullivan. That just means there are so many notes done so quickly, and there are more tra-la-las per square inch than in any of the other Gilbert and Sullivans. I was very lucky to do a production of that in Scottish Opera last year, which just went around, and it's remarkable how few people have actually seen the pieces, and I defy them when they actually go not to actually have a good time. Unfortunately, after that, Gilbert was a very litigious gentleman, and in going through the accounts after Gondoliers, he found that £500 had been paid for refurbishing the carpets in the dress circle bar. Now, those of you who have been to the dress circle bar will realise how tiny that bar is, but Gilbert was horrified that he had to pay a third with Sullivan at that point. So it basically became the destruction of the relationship. They came back to produce a piece called Utopia Limited, which was not a success, and Gondoliers. Right, so that's the history of them. GNS, as I said, continued on in Australia until the end of copyright, which was in 1962. That was the thing that Jace Williamson always put on each year. I'm sick to death of the number of people that say their grandmothers or grandfathers took them to GNS when they were this high at the Tivoli or whatever. Almost invariably, they starred people from the original D'Oyly-Carte company in London, who were sent out by Rupert D'Oyly-Carte to the Antipodes to perform, and it was a huge, and still is, I believe, a huge part of our cultural heritage. So much so that at the State Opera South Australia, finally this artistic director can put on a season of Gilbert and Sullivan. So we're doing a festival. I'm going to need your help. We're doing a festival at Her Majesty's Theatre from the 11th of May until the 21st of May. We're doing new productions of The Pirates of Penzance, HMS Pinafore, and in the courts, trial by jury as well. So that's up close and personal. We can't put on enough trial by juries. Every time we put them on, they sell out. It helps that there are only 80 people in the court, but that's a different story too. But there are still some performances that we're going to be adding in during the season. We also will be going over here to whichever side it is, famously to the cathedral to do a thing called Sacred Sullivan. Sullivan was a great onward Christian soldiers, if I can say that. He's a great hymn writer. We're also doing my one-man show, and we're doing a community performance of The Sorcerer. Basically, 180 people will be descending upon the stage of Her Majesty's Theatre to sing in the chorus of The Sorcerer. It's a great chorus work. Starts with Ring Forth Ye Bells. What can I say? So I know one lady that's going to be coming along. Look, there are many other things. There are lunches, there are talks. It's just a celebration of all things GNS in this town, which will be sort of here it is. You got it? We've got the music, we haven't got the face. It's all happening. And as I said, it's... what are you doing? I can sing it for you. Maybe that's easier. No, we're there. Any questions before we... Oh, sorry.
That's fine. I'll find this. Any questions?
I'll go to all the questions as well.
So, not having grown up in an English-speaking country, I have to admit I was blissfully unaware of Gilbert and Sullivan for the first 30 years of my life. That is pretty much my question. So if Gilbert and Sullivan is so successful in English-speaking countries, while if you look at opera, or like classical opera earlier, as well as musicals later, they tend to be much less focused on particular countries. So like Andrew Lloyd Webber plays extremely well in Germany, Wagner plays well in England. Why is it the case that Gilbert and Sullivan does not essentially play anywhere outside of England?
Okay. I think the easy answer, thank you, the easy answer to that is that these two met on completely equal terms, that the words were as important as the music. And the joy of it is that you can get something like Titwillow, the joy is that you can get something like Titwillow, for example, where if you read the words, they're hysterical, as in, is it a weakness of intellect, birdie, I cried, or a rather tough worm in your little inside? But you put it to Sullivan's music and it becomes melancholy, it becomes joyous, it's just a very different thing. Whereas if you look at the operas of Leha, for example, and also really the only in the English-speaking world, the only operettas that anybody performs these days tend to be Merry Widow and the Fledermaus of Strauss. So it's a much, much smaller group of things that are recorded. The libretto is much less important in that. It's a storyline. Whereas the GNSs still exist on their own terms. If you look at any of the operettas of Rudolf Frimmel at the beginning of the 20th century, or Victor Herbert, or any of those people that were refugees from Jewish refugees from Europe, almost invariably the music lives on, but the words and the scripts don't. Or any of the early works of Cole Porter, for example. Whenever you see them these days, they are always revived, but with new librettos, rethinking. So the point is, I think that the two are indescribable. And also, what is your language? German. There's a very famous story of Kaiser Wilhelm coming to England, and he was horrified that, staying at the Savoy, horrified that they weren't playing Pinafore, because he said, and he polished up the candle on the big front door. I don't know whether it's true, but anyway, there you go. This is the story. And it's something like the Nightmare Song in Iolanthe, for example, which chronicles how this man's nightmare occurs. I'll just recite it for you for a moment. He says, when you're lying awake with a dismal headache and repose is tabooed by anxiety, I conceive you may use any language you choose to indulge in without impropriety. For your brain is on fire, the bedclothes conspire of usual slumber to plunder you. First your counterpane goes and uncovers your toes, then your sheet slips demurely from under you. So you get the idea that actually it's really hard. It's really hard to translate that. But Die Piraten gets quite a few performances still. There was one reasonably recently in not Bremen, I don't know, somewhere there, and also Das Mikado is a very big one as well. But I think that's usually there. French never like us. What can I say?
One more question.
You want? The gentleman.
David?
It's probably a little bit off kilter a bit, but you would have come across a lot of opera singers, famous personalities. And one of my business associates had a lot to do with Pavarotti, and he was a very big prima donna. Have you got any cracking stories about a certain
prima donnas? Look, I'm sure not that I should say. I will say that Pavarotti is the only. He came to Opera Australia to do the boheme in the 1980s, and we found him everything but a prima donna there. Look, Joan Sutherland was probably the greatest of Australian sopranos that worked at Opera Australia in my time, and again, she was the most glorious woman. Don't cross her, I might add, but the most glorious woman. Look, there are lots of people no, I can't really say all these terrible things, can I? Really, but no. Basically, you've got to love opera singers to do what we do. There's no sense in it. What they do is just so unusual and so special. If you're talking about anybody that sings Wagner or whatever, you can count on one hand the number of people who are singing at the top of their game now, doing the tenor roles in Wagner. It's a really specialised, difficult thing, and so I'm sure there's a lot of difficulty. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to. Oh, actually, I will tell you one story that a very good friend of mine who was playing the title role in Idomeneo in Mozart, one of the pinnacle roles in Mozart, was playing at the Fenice in Venice, one of the greatest theatres in the circuit, and Fenice had premiered Idomeneo there, so a lot of pressure. This man, this is the pinnacle of his life. He was there for 5 weeks, he rehearsed for 3.5, then did 2 weeks of performances, miserable because he's away from home, he's away from all his friends, and all he's doing is relying on 2 tiny little things in the back of his throat and his art. I think they're all mad to do it, I must admit, but you've got to take your hat off to them that they are creating magic with their own instrument.
Right.
Okay, that's it.
And thanking you, Stuart.